Hello everyone, this is Greg. It's Thursday evening. How are you doing? I thought I would just send out a little video rather than type quite a bit tonight. And just wanted to remind you that Friday we'll have our online session so we can talk about anything you need before the assignment or the final. And don't forget the final that's in week 8. That is a practice final, and if you want to work away at those, I will supply you with the answers so that you're prepared for the final that will be given on Monday morning. Okay, now just a couple of things on the study and some theory in general. This is a very good study, and for a couple of reasons. The first is that the first research question, which is, does poetry have an effect on vocabulary? What they've done is they've set up, which is almost what's called a classic experiment. So in this experiment, you have randomized, you pull randomly from the population, then you randomize which people are going to go in the control and the experimental group. And both those processes are important for external validity. If you don't randomize, then you don't pull a representative subset of the population, so your results can't apply to the population. So that's pretty important. The second thing is it has a control group and an experimental group. And the control group serves the purpose of determining whether the manipulation of the independent variable, which is the application of the poetry reading, is the sole difference in the two groups. Okay? Now, given that that's the sole difference, then what we know? There could be other differences. For instance, maybe the group that got read the poetry, maybe they were read poetry by a teacher that was substantially more skilled in some way. So the control group can't always create equal conditions. And when it can't, these are what are called threats to internal validity. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's go to the beginning of the experiment, in which they used a two-sample t-test to see if the two groups had the same mean, or whether the hypothesis that the same mean could be rejected or not before the poetry allowed us to say that the groups were equivalent, roughly equivalent originally. Then after the poetry reading, the groups were measured again, and there was found to be a statistical difference. So what you have to understand is that the quality of the experiment determines how confident you are in the fact that the independent variable, which is the poetry reading, was the cause of the change of the test scores. Now, there could be other things that accounted for the change in the test scores. That's why an experiment, each group has to be the same except for the independent variable, so that you don't have threats to internal validity, which is coming to the conclusion that something caused something when that probably wasn't the case. The other issue is that during the post-test, yes, there was a statistical difference between the control and the experimental group. Now, what's commonly mistaken is that, yes, the mean of the experimental group can be higher than the mean of the control group, but that doesn't mean there's a statistical difference. Remember, a statistical difference means that it's highly likely that the means of the populations from which the samples came were different. Now, what are those populations? Well, those are theoretical populations. If one population, the sample from the control group, the population would then be everybody who did not receive the treatment. The population in the experimental group would be if everybody did receive the treatment. So those two samples are pulled from two hypothetical populations. Now, if there's no statistical difference, then we don't know if the means of the two groups were different or not. And one thing to keep in mind is just because the means of the two groups are different doesn't, in, for instance, the experimental group, the mean of the population that was in the experimental group could be higher, But there was people in the experimental group that did not benefit much from the poetry reading. So the scientific notion of cause and effect, if A then B, if not A then not B, isn't clearly shown here because it didn't affect everyone. All right, so science's view of cause and effect is a little bit different than what we have here. We come to the conclusion that at a certain level the poetry was the cause, but it may not really be. So that's the thing. It's the quality of the experiment which determines whether you believe there was cause and effect or not. It's the t-test that just measures whether there's a difference in the means. Now, maybe there's another concept called effect size, which says, yes, the mean of the experimental group went up, but how many people actually benefited from it? So there's some other statistics involved. So when you're looking for your article for your assignment, make sure you just stick as closely as possible to an article which shows, just like this, a pre and a post test with a control and an experimental group, and the groups are randomized, and a very clear manipulation of the independent variable and an instrument that measures the dependent variable, like a test. And don't look for anything that's ANOVA or correlation, and don't report anything that you don't understand. Don't read more into it than is there. Just look for a pure, simple experiment if possible. So what you don't want to look for is something that is like research question number 2 with the genders. That wasn't a true experiment. That's what's called causal comparative. Now, it was true that there was no difference between the genders after the post-test, but the gender was not the independent. The gender was the independent variable, but it was not manipulated in any way. So this is like comparing smokers and non-smokers and to see if there's a difference between cancer rates. Well, there probably is, but that doesn't mean smoking is the cause of cancer. Now, we know from overwhelming research it probably is, but it very well could be that smokers eat a lot more high-fat food and like to barbecue a lot more. It is not a scientific experiment that shows smoking is the cause of cancer. And most research is done this way. It's called causal comparative. So it gives us reason to conduct experiments. So the second one with the gender is not an experiment. And that's why I like that study, because you need to know what is an experiment and what is clearly not. And then in the third research hypothesis, we've talked about that a little. They hypothesized that there would be no effect of poetry on grammar. So then their null hypothesis would have to be that there is an effect. Well, from the scientific point of view, your null hypothesis is usually that the manipulation of the independent variable will not change the dependent variable. So science has no way of knowing whether a certain teaching method will produce results or not. So that's the null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is that the manipulation of the independent variable will produce a change in the dependent variable. Okay, so that's how you have to interpret that. So it was a good week. Really look at this study carefully and look at all the wording in it. The other thing you could do, which is really important and will increase your confidence in these, is you can go to any one of the 6 tables and you can take the t-test, and they give you the 2 means, the 2 sample sizes, and the 2 sample standard deviations. And I really encourage this, and I'd like you to see that you do this in your Saturday assignment. Actually see if their p-values are correct. So now you've learned how to conduct a 2 sample t-test, so you can actually take the research, the numbers reported, and see if they're the correct numbers. And quite often they're not. You will find mistakes in these. You don't need the individual samples themselves, because as we learned in the week where you did the 2 sample t-test, all you need is the mean, the standard deviation, and the sample size, and you can run the two-sample t-test. So see if their p-values are correct. And it's very good practice on using the two-sample t-test. So that's about all for now. This is a very good study. Look for one that matches the research hypothesis, the first one in our study, and look for one in which the null hypothesis is clearly stated, that there is no effect on SAT scores of students studying outdoors. And the alternative hypothesis is that there is an effect, that the independent variable did have an effect. That's the way the scientific method works. And I'm happy to, if you want to talk to me about the studies before you use them, we can do that too. So we'll be online at 6:30 tomorrow night, and there's lots of questions that we can answer. I just want to make clear the Saturday assignment is due Sunday morning, and then Monday morning you will be mailed the final, and then you have until Friday to finish that. And it certainly won't take you 4 days if you take your time. So that's how things are going to wrap up here, and everybody's done a good job. And I really believe this is the most important week, because quantitative research is about searching for cause and effect relationships and associations, and this is a good study to do it. So everyone have a great evening. We will be here at 6:30 tomorrow night to answer any more questions, and thank you very much. Goodbye.